Good morning. Welcome to Life Expansion After 50 podcast. Today's episode focuses on the high leverage space between reaction and response. This step is one of the most important because it's where our power begins to come online and where most of the available literature on personal development tends to focus. The first 6 steps in the stimulus response cycle are largely habitual, even in the pre-stimulus phase. While the pre-stimulus phase precedes the specific stimulus response cycle in question, it is itself part of a chain of other stimulus response cycles. Researchers estimate that we make over 30,000 decisions every day. Given that 95% of our lives are governed by habit, that makes sense. Most of these decisions are likely driven by associations, which are from the past, generally speaking. With approximately 60,000 waking seconds in a day, it's clear how much of our behavior is habitual. Each of these thousands of stimulus response cycles shapes our state of being and in turn forms our personality. While we're not defined by our behaviors create the personality that others see and interact with and greatly influences the results that we get, good and bad. Your state of being, the moment to moment, either places you at the cause or at the effect of the next cycle. And with 30,000 decisions in a day, think about that's cycle after cycle after cycle. Every other second, we could be having another stimulus response cycle. So they're literally like layered on. This is one reason why transformations often take 3 to 6 months. I'm not talking about mental health here. My work focuses on helping individuals break through the upper limit barriers, the kind that can hold people back for an entire lifetime. In 3 to 6 months, you can break through and begin operating above those barriers, stepping into a space where infinite possibilities reside. Fully owning this space takes longer. You'll move through stages, unconscious incompetence, where you don't realize the need for change, conscious incompetence, where you understand the gap but may still struggle, conscious competence, where you can perform well on good days, but may falter during challenges. And you'll often hear me say that I like plans that'll work on a bad day of a bad week because the majority of the population has not gone through work like this. And so they're going to be subject to their habits. And on a bad day of a bad week, they're already stressed, which means they have less access to the agency, less access to the best version of themselves. And when you start stacking that on like a team, that's why I want plans that work on a bad day of a bad week. Now, what's interesting is when people plan out, and this is a cognitive bias, actually, they plan based on perfection. They plan based on everything working well, or at least certainly in the upper third, but it almost never does. Even when faced with proof that the last 5 tries were in the bottom third in terms of the ratio of intention to actually outcome, they still will double down and say, yes, but this time will be different. It's really interesting how that works. And you can find some of that in the book, The Willpower Instinct by Kelly McGonigal. Now, finally, with repetition and practice, you'll reach unconscious competence, a habitual state of mastery. Let me also clarify a distinction. Most of my work operates in the realm of creation mode. In operational context, mastery of the stimulus response cycle is less critical because past habits generally serve you well. Operational models are structured. They keep deviations minimal. In creation mode, however, with 30,000 decisions and infinite possibilities facing us every day, leverage can cut both ways. This is where living by principles becomes essential. Principles endure and act as a compass, ensuring that even when things go wrong, your foundation remains solid. Now, the space between reaction and response, which is what we're talking about today, is where choice begins. It's where our power starts to come online, as I said. It's where we shift from being reactive to proactive. This is the second opportunity to interrupt the habitual patterns. The first being in the stimulus to reaction step, where deep practice can condition a new habitual reaction to replace outdated survival instincts. This is important because that space from stimulus to reaction can be as little as 150 milliseconds. So think less than 0.2 of a second. And it's habitual. And the more stressed we are, the more likely we are to have a very fast reaction time. That's a problem because those survival reactions are from the past. And the other reason why it's a problem is that those reactions tend to come across as thinking. And when it comes across as thinking, we can interpret it as our conscious mind. And that's because thought and impulse have the same signature. They're both energy. In this work, you learn to distinguish between thought and impulse. And that's where the work that's where the unconscious competence comes into play, because we're literally taking the subconscious from where many people have put it. I've even heard people call the subconscious the higher self, but we're taking the subconscious from above the conscious mind to below the conscious mind. So ideally, we've got the higher self, the conscious mind, and then the subconscious is serving the two above. But somewhere around 30, 35 years old, often people will abdicate their responsibility to engage the conscious mind because it's hard. It takes energy. And the subconscious is so fast and so efficient. We don't like making mistakes. We just turn it over to the subconscious and we feel like our mistakes go away. They may go away at the small scale, but the challenge is we face the potential for huge mistakes because it's that decision between reaction, response, and action that shapes our world. Otherwise, we're just living a habitual life over and over and over and over. Now, deep practice can condition in a new habitual reaction to replace outdated survival instincts. This is not rocket science. It takes some work. It's not hard work, but it does take a commitment. And that's why we want to start with purpose, self-actualization, a vision, some big why, a why that's big enough to keep you going when the subconscious has you scared that this is going to be the end of the world if you do it. Now, I've used the example of getting rid of ums in speaking. It happens very quickly. I treat the ums like an old survival reaction, and I condition in a pause instead. Within days, even that pause will often go away as clients work through it, especially if they're speaking regularly, because what we'll do is spend time conditioning the pause. We don't just condition out the we condition in the pause, and you literally, it becomes like deep practice. You wrap a little bit of myelin around that neural pathway and it fires every time. You still have to make a choice in the beginning, because in the beginning, it's awareness. You become aware that I'm about to say, and this is why you need a big why. You have to make the choice that you're not going to say the So in the beginning, it's choosing, but eventually it becomes a habit. The reaction to response space is also where our greatest power resides, as I've alluded to, but that power is finite and must be used wisely. For example, willpower resides here. However, willpower diminishes with use throughout the day and with decision making. Literally, if you've heard the thing, eat the frog first thing in the morning, do the tough things at the beginning of the day. And this is not about being a morning person or a night person. If you're awake, your willpower is waning. If you're making decisions, your willpower is being diminished. You want to do the big things in the morning, even if you are a morning person, an evening person. And if you have trouble getting going in the morning, what I would recommend trying is drinking some water. Half a liter of water will often do the trick, because think about it. If you've been sleeping 6, 7, 8 hours, that's dehydration time. And if you stop drinking 2 or 3 hours before bedtime, now you've got 10 hours, up to 10 hours of dehydration, and your brain needs nutrients and oxygen, and the nutrients and oxygen get to your brain through the blood. If you're dehydrated, the blood is thickened, and as the blood thickens, it moves more slowly, which means you're going to have less nutrients and oxygen in your brain. Just by drinking, and I prefer a whole liter. I'll drink a liter of water in the morning first thing. And I may wake up feeling like, oh, I want a cup of coffee. If I drink a liter of water, I'll drink the coffee because I want to, not because I feel like I need to. It's a game changer. Try it give yourself a week. Do it for a week straight, and then do it for a week straight. Test it. I like to test things in a controlled environment, the same way scientists do, and you make your own decision. But again, willpower wanes during the day. And sometimes if you have a big afternoon, you may want to take a power nap, learn to do some meditations, etc., that can sort of recharge you. Because if you get away from it a little bit, taking a walk, things like that, you can start to refill that tank. But what really does it is getting a good night's sleep and starting over again. So the big work, I say, should be done in the beginning of the day, if possible. Now, it's more effective to use willpower for big strategic decisions because it diminishes, as I said, like scheduling a workout with a trainer if you struggle to get to the gym, or shopping strategically to avoid bringing tempting foods into the house if you struggle with temptation in eating the foods that you don't want to eat. Guided meditation is another tool. Visualization during meditation can precondition your choices and influence how you respond. It's kind of interesting because visualization above the line in infinite possibility is a little bit different than visualization in an operational mode where you can actually make pictures. You've got real pictures of things. Up here, it's more like you have to sense it. You're sensing the visual because you don't really know how it's going to unfold because you're interacting or you're pursuing from within infinite possibilities. Another resource could be writing down your top 3 to 5 goals, the same goals. I wouldn't do 10 or 15. It waters it down. I wouldn't do 1. It's not enough. I like 3. You write down 3 top goals for the next 3 to 5 years. I wouldn't be changing it. Pick a goal for 3 to 5 years and write it down, because what it'll do, your reticular activating system starts to work like a filter. And as you make decisions, remember the subconscious can process up to 11 million bits per second. So as the subconscious is processing this 11 million bits per second by writing your goals down 3 times every morning, or 3 goals every morning, what it does is it starts to filter things out, or I should say filter things in, and pass them on to the conscious mind that are aligned with those goals. As you make decisions, you're not just making a decision in a vacuum, making a decision in the context of what's your 3 to 5 year goal. You will see this automaticity happen, and then all of a sudden, it's like serendipity happens. This is where people talk about, I manifested it. Yeah, you kind of did, but it's not in the sense that it manifested like poof. It's you manifested it because you were doing the work, and the reticular activating system kept you going on this narrower and narrower path. It's sort of like if you're deciding on a road trip and you keep your cone of direction in a certain amount of degrees, you only have so many options that you can get to within a given amount of time, right? If you've driven 10 hours and you got 3 more to go, there's only so many places you can reach within that 3 hours. All of this stuff out here is no longer available to you. And this is kind of what happens when you write your goals down every day, your top 3 goals. You're creating this cone. You may start here, but you're bringing that cone together because the reticular activating system is helping you layer decision on top of decision on top of decision. And then all of a sudden, the serendipity shows up. Now, there's a place for miracles and things of that nature, divine intervention. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about everything I talk about here. I can describe it using science-backed research, because I want to take that woo-woo stuff completely off the table. You can't have agency if you're sitting there hoping the woo-woo is going to come through for you. You can't have agency if you're fearful that the woo-woo may not come through for you. So I don't even want to bring that into the conversation. And that's why you'll hear me talk about or reframing what manifestation actually is, why visualization works. Visualization works in part because we're making the unfamiliar familiar, so we don't reject it. But that's for another story. Now, again, this is powerful when you write the goals down, the top 3 goals, because you're also bringing myelin into play. You're conditioning the neural pathways that are going after those goals, and it becomes habitual and automatic. Nothing woo-woo about it. It's literally a way to get myelin. And remember, we wrap myelin with repetition, duration, intensity, and impact. And I would say the impact and intensity, that's where your dopamine really comes into play. The repetition and the duration is more on the side of deep practice, but they're all part of it. And because neurons fire and wire both ways, it's very complex in how it works. But if you just think about it as repetition, duration, intensity, impact, and you use them in combination when possible, you can condition yourself to do just about anything that you want. Now, I could dedicate an entire series to the space between reaction and response, and likely will after covering the last 3 areas of the 7 fitness areas framework, which is relationships, professional, and financial, because I want to put some additional principles on the table. I focus all on the first 4. Even with clients, I'm focusing on the first 4: mental, spiritual, physical, emotional. And we're doing laps around those 4 because we have to get the state of being to such that we can actually start to do the last phase. This is the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. We're getting into that state of being. And then the emotional part is the last part of the doing. And then we get to have the relationships that we want. We get to have the career, the professional opportunities that we want. We get to have the financial goals that we're setting. Before I dive into today's topic, let me reiterate a key distinction I discussed last week. Reaction in this context is the initial subconscious impulse. It's happening in like 0.2 of a second. It's totally subconscious. We don't have any say over it in the real time. We can influence it with deep practice, which happens in advance. Response. This is what we consciously choose to do. So we have the reaction, and we don't want the response to equal the reaction. We've got to have that space. And that's what we're talking about today, between reaction and response, because this is where choice begins. If you don't exercise choice, your response becomes your reaction. And when you look at your life, it's a series of habitual patterns that you played out over and over and over, despite your conviction to wanting to change. Action is the execution, the how, when, maybe to what degree we follow through on the response. So you have the reaction, which is what the stimulus, which is what the subconscious says, here's what you should do in this situation. But remember, that's an association from the past. And the more stressed you are, the more it's a survival reaction as opposed to simply a reaction or an association. That passes on the information to the response. All you need is a 1/4 second pause. It's like this. The subconscious has a reaction time of anywhere from 150 to say 250 milliseconds. So think 1/4 of a second. And it could be longer, obviously, if you're distracted. And then the conscious mind has a reaction time of about 1/2 second. So in that 1/4 of a second, we start to have some pause, some space. Now, the subconscious is still working, right? Because it processes 11 million bits per second. So it's got the reaction, and now it's doubling down on that reaction. The conscious mind comes online at 1/2 second in, which is 1/4 second after the initial impulse was hit, what was reached. This is where we can reject that impulse. Nope, we're not going to do that. This is what I want to do. And you can condition that in as well. And that's where what I'll be talking about today. That's why I was saying more of these self-development literature, things like affirmations and reframing, transformational vocabulary. These things come more into play as we start making these choices. Guided meditations can help here. So while it may sound like I'm splitting hairs, and I am, mastering these distinctions is essential for gaining control of the stimulus response cycle. Once you've developed unconscious competence, these steps just blend seamlessly into a habitual state of being, allowing your subconscious to work effortlessly in your favor. This is what I mean when I say putting the automaticity of the subconscious to work for your vision and your life design. Now, let's get into this response step. Last week, I'll just do this quickly. So last week, we talked about the pre-stimulus phase, beliefs, neuroplasticity, which is your current habit state, priming, and mindset. And I talked about how mindset is very fluid, and you have to be careful because you can have a fixed mindset about the bigger context, but growth mindset around the bigger context, but you have some fixed mindset elements inside of it, and those will stop you. And while this is a pre-stimulus phase, remember, if we're making 30,000 decisions a day, we're constantly living in a stimulus response cycle. So we're always walking into our stimulus from a state of being. That state of being can come from this pre-stimulus phase. And then you have the stimulus response, stimulus reaction, and then reaction to response, and then reaction, and this should say action. Stimulus, reaction, response, action. That's next week's topic. We'll be talking about that, taking the response and then deciding the who, what, when, where, how, and how much. Then I mentioned that we have the neuroplasticity, the beliefs, the priming, and the mindset. And one of the things I don't talk about often here is physiology. The physiology, it has to be, or the physiology will dictate this state of being. If you're dehydrated, as I said, your brain is not getting the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. So we've got the physiology, and also even just holding yourself upright and with good stature, good posture, you actually signal your body in such a way that you're more resourceful. If you start slouching and breathing shallow and you're closing in your vision, you're looking down, you start sending your body into like a stress response. I'm not saying it's already fight or flight, but you're leaning in that way. And why would we want to start leaning towards stress response? So these things, beliefs, neuroplasticity, physiology, priming, and mindset, lead us to a state of being. And we're walking around in this state of being. And because this is happening, this cycle is happening 30,000 times a day, that state of being is like our behaviors that people see. It's like our personality. And while that the behaviors don't define us, as I said, it is what people see and it is what generates our results. That state of being steps into the stimulus. So if you're tracking with me, this is why it takes 3 to 6 months. You are literally going over and over into a new stimulus with the old paradigm, so to speak. And this is where we start to make the change. If a person is triggered just by talking about it, let's say that they lost their business, and this was me. I mean, I lost everything, and just talking about it was a triggering. And you have to get past that, because you can't create goodness from a state of lack and fear and that. Then we talked about the upper limit and the lower limits. That's UL, upper limit. And then this is the barrier. And this above the barrier is above the line. And I talk about how you may start working on it and you're doing meditations, you're drinking the water, you're working on the mindset, you're working on your priming, but you don't see any breakthrough yet. This is a difficult line to cross. For some of us, we've been living with that barrier. It's conditioned for decades. So if it takes 2 months to cross it, that's a small price to pay. And if you've been living from 30 to 50 with this line, it's going to be hard to cross. But what's happening is your lows are getting higher. You're making higher lows. And then once you get into this barrier, and in the barrier, you have your stories, your habits, you may have been a bully, you may have been bullied, you have good experiences which may lock you in, like the athlete who says, I'm always wearing these same socks. Or you may have bad experiences where you never want to touch that hot stove again, the equivalent. And what we don't want to do is drop back down. You're going to have a lot of cognitive dissonance in here, because we're doing something that we believed was impossible. And this cognitive dissonance can feel like anxiety, and it often takes people off it catches people off guard, and next thing you know, they're dropping back down because they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it's just cognitive dissonance. And I have to remind people of that. And once you recognize it as cognitive dissonance, you spot it. You say, oh, yeah, good. I'm about to have a breakthrough. Because you can't have a breakthrough without some confusion, without some cognitive dissonance, without a break from the past. And once you recognize that you're about to have a breakthrough, literally just going to bed, the neuroplasticity kicks in. You go from fearing what's coming up next to having a great plan for what to do next, because the neuroplasticity reworked itself. It's called synaptogenesis, where the neurotransmitter shifts from neural pathways that are no longer needed or no longer being used, the ones that you've conditioned out, and it moves that neurotransmitter to the new neural pathway. This is how habit change happens, which is why we talk about replacing habits instead of breaking habits or stopping a habit. And then I finish with this one. You have the stimulus, reaction, and response. And this is the area where it's like 150 milliseconds, 250 milliseconds in here. So we have a positivity exercise I covered last week. It's in episode 66. This is so fast that you can't do this with conscious mind. You've got to program it in at the subconscious level. So it's a 6-week exercise that you go through 3 times a day, 90 seconds per rep. It's a very simple thing to do, but you have to do it. If you don't do it, you're not going to condition it. And then mental contrasting, I brought up the Stockdale paradox. What I have to do is very difficult, but I know I'll prevail. It's being able to see both of those. And while this is not really, mental contrasting is not really done in the condition step, it's happened before. It's when you think about things, the way you think about information, you've got to be thinking about it in the context of it's going to be hard, especially when you're above the line. Obviously, in operational mode, you don't have the unfamiliarity working against you, but you want to be able to step into situations so when you have that bad week, it's not a surprise. You know that some weeks are going to be bad. It's just the way it is because you're above the line. You're working on your goal. You're doing something you've never done before. It's okay. And that's very different than, oh my gosh, the house is going to burn down because, I stubbed my toe. You see, I put down this whole thing is 750 milliseconds, 3/4 of a second. Potentially, it could be longer. And that's what we'll talk about next week, because sometimes you may have to delay the action. If you're triggered, you don't want to decide the action, right? If you've got the response, I'm going to confront them, but you're being triggered, that confrontation could turn into a real confrontation. And this drawing down here was just illustrating how we were layering on these stimulus response cycles all day, 30,000 of them. So we have the state of being, right? And we said that we have several inputs: the beliefs, the neuroplasticity, physiology, priming, and mindset. And then this takes us to the next stimulus. And we're always being faced with the new stimulus. It's just constant if we're awake. And if you're going above the line, there's always going to be something to pay attention to. So we want to get a handle on that. So we've got the stimulus. And then we have the reaction. And then this arrow is huge impact, because this is where we start to have choice. Choice comes into play here. This is where you can reframe things. This is where you can interrupt the pattern. You can start to use transformational vocabulary again. I mentioned transformational vocabulary as a tool for priming, but it also works here. Now, let me give you an example. Oh, also a big one, I'll put perspective because it's so significant. Now, let me give you an example, and you can do this real time, and in, I don't know, we'll do it, maybe take us 2 minutes. I want you to think of something, and again, when we do these exercises, obviously not while you're driving, but also nothing major, nothing that's like gut wrenching or that you're having PTSD about. This is just something kind of simple. Think about a debate / argument, more in the, cusp of that. I don't want a deep argument, but something that you disagreed with someone and you left it in a disagreement. You guys still are in disagreement, and something that got a little bit heated, not 8, 9, 10 level, but 4, 5, 6 level. It got a little bit heated and you're kind of annoyed about it. I want you to go in and we're doing this exercise real time. I want you to go into state, and I want you to be looking at the person and imagine yourself speaking. So you're looking through your own eyes. You don't see yourself, you see them, and you see what's behind them, and you're speaking to them, and they're speaking to you. And now I want you to imagine that you leave yourself there, but your awareness, you float out of yourself around to the side, and now you're looking at both of you. So you see both of you speaking to each other. Don't pay attention yet. Continue to move around, and now you're looking at yourself over their shoulder. And from that position of looking at yourself over their shoulder, I want you to continue the discussion. And you can speed it up, right? Because it's all in your mind. You can speed up this discussion. Go through the whole argument, go through the debate, watching yourself interact with them. Watch how you respond to what they say. Watch your facial expressions and your intensity as you speak to them. Now, come back around, your awareness, come back around and come back into yourself. So you're back facing them, and now close out the sequence. So that's perspective. Just by changing the perspective, some of you will have observed that you were making some mistakes, or maybe that you were being a little bit aggressive, or that maybe you were being triggered, maybe you weren't listening, maybe you were cutting them off. Perspective is powerful. Another thing you can do, and so if you, let's say that, again, we're talking about what you can do in this space between reaction and response. And in this response, I'll just call it R2. After the choice, and all, what's nice about it is this can all happen in a quarter of a second. If you did that exercise, you'll notice it didn't take very long for you to spot it. What happens is we're in the habit of letting our response equal our reaction, and so we don't pause. Even if you try to pause, and I'll get to that in a moment, because it's like you're disagreeing with yourself. In fact, I'll just cover it right now. I mentioned that this here is an impulse. From here to here is an impulse. From here to here, you have the opportunity to make it a thought. So an impulse coming from the subconscious is the firing and wiring the neurons, 100 billion neurons, each connected with thousands of other neurons. Energy is pulsing through those neural pathways. So the neural pathways are physiological. The energy going through there is energy. And that's the impulse that you get. That impulse has the same signature as thought, because the base level of thought is energy. So this feels and seems like this until you start making the distinctions. Now, if you're used to having your impulse, and people who are really, really good operationally, it's like almost like the more you do it, the more you reinforce it. It's very difficult for, I shouldn't say it that way. I would say it's more difficult for a person who's really good with operational excellence to treat their thought differently from the impulse, because it's what served them. They've won, they've made the awards, they've been top in their class. They've done it through following their impulse, because it's in an operational environment. When you're in a project environment, above the line, as I said, going through that barrier and then up into complete possibilities. So this area up here, is all possibility. Here, it's defined. You have this condition, you've got structure, you've got past associations. Up here, you have no hooks to hang this stuff on. You have no associations. That's why we use visualization and other things we'll get into later. Now, if you are in the mind of making this thought the same as your impulse, or making an impulse at the level of a thought. So let me back up a little bit more. This is subconscious. This is conscious. Hopefully you can see how this thing unfolds, because if my impulse is a survival reaction and I treat it as a conscious thought, I double down on that survival reaction. Most impulses are from the past because associations of the past, habits are from associations. This thought then doubles down on that, and then you just keep doubling down, and then you explain it and you justify it, and next thing you know, you're justifying and you're doing presentations on why this is true, and this is a survival reaction from 5 years ago. You can see this throughout life. Once you start looking for it, people getting into or trying to avoid a car accident, survival reaction. Somebody gets assaulted or threatened, survival reaction. You look at some of these videos with police and motorists that doing all these YouTube videos, and you see the police and the motorists having an escalating interaction. You can see it there. It's that they get stuck. They get stuck and they can't get away from it because they've already made the decision. So a big part of it is having the perspective. And if you're a person, so again, I'll go back to the operational. If operational excellence has been your jam, one of the things that you can do is condition in a perspective step or a reframe step. And here's what the reframe step would look like. That person did something and I'm offended. But before you decide to respond from a state of being offended, and certainly before you act on it, you reframe it to say, subconscious, give me a time that I had that same behavior and show it to me. You're not saying that real time. What you're doing is, because the awareness is here, your conscious mind is here, your subconscious is below, you're working this in during meditation, you're working it in during mindfulness, you're working it in, instead of just having random 30,000 decisions a day, you're literally visualizing these things. So you're visualizing your subconscious giving you examples of when you did that same behavior. Now imagine what happens. Somebody does something that offends you. It puts you in the position, because everyone's done the same behavior. I'll use driving as an example. There have been times where you've cut people off if you've been driving any length of time. Hopefully it's because you didn't see them, right? I've been riding a motorcycle for 50 years. Trust me, I've been cut off by hundreds and hundreds of people. And I would say the vast majority of them did not see me. Now, I've been riding with friends who just flip out. They start giving the person the finger and they're cursing at him and they're yelling at him. Back in New York in the old days, guys would carry ball bearings and throw them at the people's windshield. I don't condone that, obviously, but it was pretty radical in the 60s and 70s in the city. I'm sure it was like that in California as well. Anyway, my point is this. We've all cut people off. And when somebody cuts in front of you and you've already programmed your subconscious to put yourself in the position where you've done that same exact behavior and come up with an explanation for it, why you did it. Hopefully that's enough. And it can be done in a half a second. It's enough to have some grace for that person. So I'm not suggesting everybody does that. This is where I work with clients, and it gets very prescriptive here. There's so many different things we can do. We may focus on affirmations. Maybe we focus on more priming. Maybe we focus on guided meditation. Maybe we focus on less caffeine, right? More rest. More breaks. What I'm doing here, we want to stack the deck on our ability to get into mindfulness. The more you can get into mindfulness, the more you can take charge of the powerful present moment. From reaction to response, and reaction and response to action is what I call that powerful present moment. And that powerful present moment could be a half a second, it could be a few seconds. In that powerful present moment, we have thought, We have consciousness, and we have mind. And this is where you can make choices. So by stacking the deck to where you can get mindful, you're more likely to make a good choice. So what do I mean by this? So first of all, we have conscious, we want those conscious moments to be pure. We don't want them to be filled with regrets of the past or anxiety of the future. We want them to be pure. So your consciousness, we can assume that the consciousness is always pure. We want the mind to be clear. We don't want the mind to be distracted. We don't want the mind to have a lot of chatter in it and like the squirrel looking here, looking there. We want the mind to be calm, especially as you step into potentially difficult situations. And then, as I said, you want the thought to be clear. You don't want it to be on the regrets of the past or anxiety of the future or fears. When you have this powerful present moment, then you can make a better choice. And so this list, as you can imagine, can go on and on. That's why I said I could do a whole series just on this space here. But there's so much literature written about it that, it's like, where do you begin? Where do you end? And this is why when I get into the relationships, professional and financial, I'll have guests on the podcast to get different perspectives. And then I'll put it back in the context of this whole state of being, pre-stimulus and stimulus response. So that's where we are now. We don't want the response to equal the reaction. And if you do nothing else but add being proactive, and I guess this is another big one, be proactive, not reactive. When I first read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I remember the first habit is be proactive. And the habits start somewhere around the middle of the book, I think. And I don't recall if it was right there. I think it was in that chapter or in the habit where it said, don't go on to the second habit until you've gone 30 days in a row with being proactive every single day. It took me three or four attempts and over a 2-month period. Being proactive is very difficult. You may think you're proactive, but when you put yourself on the line like that and you're being authentic and you're being true to yourself, you will see your thoughts come in. It's all reactive. It's all this. And being proactive means you're going to put a pause, a quarter to a half second pause between reaction and response. And that pause is enough for you to be proactive. Proactive could be rejecting the reaction. This is where the writing your goals down every day, because now you have some reminder, you have some neural pathways around it. But this pause is so important, because if you don't make the pause here and you're running with your impulse, remember the subconscious, it's got 100 billion neurons. And they're processing at 11 million bits per second. If you let your response equal your reaction, all you've done is reinforce this direction. And now this 11 million bits per second is off and running, and it's exponential. So every quarter of a second that you're going into this thing is expanding and it's expanding. And if you've ever had an anxiety spiral or a panic attack or something like that, I imagine that's what's going on. A phobia, you can see it happen with the phobia. A person has a phobia of snakes, you get a snake in their presence, they start, and then you mention it's only rubber and it builds. And then you say, look, it's just, and then it builds. And next thing you know, you've lost them for half a day. I remember teaching people to ski, taking people who've never skied before and show them a few things and take them to the Black Diamonds. I mean, what kid hasn't done that? Hopefully there's enough of them anyway. What would happen sometimes it worked, but oftentimes it didn't. They would like almost in their mind die, right? Like come to the edge of a cliff and feel like they're going to fall off into the abyss, or they just go full speed and go turn into a yard sale, skis all over the place, right? They're gone for the day. There's so much cortisol and adrenaline in their body from that fight or flight that they're just useless for the whole day. Even accomplished skiers, if they get freaked out too badly. I had a instructor, this guy was a top instructor. He ran the school. He was the director of the school, but he had a really, really bad accident in fog. And there's a deal where he would ski with individuals who were in the advanced class. It was like he would go out, and I was skiing with him on a foggy day, and he couldn't ski. He kept apologizing because this fog triggered this response that he was just incapable of skiing because it was foggy. And it wasn't fog that you couldn't see. It was just, you could see fine. It was just his triggering. So pay attention to this. Don't let your reaction equal your response. Be proactive, change your perspective, reframe things, give people some grace. And this would be a good time and place to journal. If you start journaling here, you'll make some distinctions and start to see things differently. I'm going to leave it there. Next week, we'll get into the space between response and action. And that's the next part. If you enter into that place with a good perspective, with thought instead of impulse, you have a lot of options, and that's where greatness begins. We'll see you next week.